There's almost a sense of anger in Putin, never a good thing for a military battle, because it wasn't that long ago that Ukraine managed to strike Russia's strategic bomber fleet. And we can get into that if you like, but that wasn't just a glancing blow. That hurt President Putin.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, former fighter pilot, prominent military analyst and host of the Red Matrix podcast. Sean, thank you very much for joining us again. Well, the Kremlin and Putin himself directly has said that Russia can't rule out seizing Sumy city in Kharkiv. Do you think Russia can realistically do that?
Well, I think let's step ourselves back a second. We are now comfortably into the middle of 2025. This war started in February 2022. Who'd have thought three and a half years on, we'd still be seeing this war grind on. Russia has always had this sort of maximalist demand for Ukraine, but has currently seized about 20% of the territory, and yet it still grinds on. We can talk about lots of the details. Russia still is on the front foot, despite lots of Ukraine's amazing efforts, not only in defense, but also striking out at Russian infrastructure behind Russian lines. But the reality on the ground is that Russia is still steadily moving forward, and therefore they are going to be setting their sights now on areas like Sumy, but bluntly, they're also looking much broader than that.
Well, exactly. I mean, Putin went further than that, speaking at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum only yesterday or the day before. He said the whole of Ukraine is Russia's as far as he's concerned, and again reiterated this false narrative that Ukrainians are actually just Russians. How far off is Russia from actually taking all of Ukraine? Because they insist they can do it via diplomacy or conflict.
Yeah, I think most military analysts think there's no chance at all of Russia being able to take the whole of Ukraine, anytime soon. Russia has lost a hell of a lot of equipment. Nobody can count the bodies specifically, but the widespread view is that Russia has now suffered over 1 million casualties, not all of them dead, but serious casualties or dead. That is not something easy for a nation to swallow up. In the world wars they did, but of course there was massive recessions afterwards because you don't have the people to run your industries back at home. So Russia's economy is also hurting. It's gone through a huge amount of tanks and equipment. Yes, it spun up its defense industrial base, which is generating more military hardware than virtually the West put together at the moment, and it's importing artillery shells from North Korea and Iran. But the harsh reality is that this is a grueling and draining battle for Russia. The challenge, of course, then is to try and look at what is its end game for this particular phase of this war. And it's difficult to tell, but the prevailing view seems to be that without the benefit of a map, it's difficult to tell your viewers and listeners, but up in the north, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, effectively the land bridge that links Russia to Crimea, and of course Crimea. Once those have been secured, I suspect that Russia will have achieved phase one of this operation. But I think what's also interesting, picking up your point about President Putin's language at that economic forum, is of late he's tempered his language significantly to placate President Trump. Whereas I think this latest outburst makes it very clear that Russia is in no mood to negotiate, is in no mood for any form of ceasefire, and also doesn't really worry what President Trump feels.
And on that, I mean, a lot of us will be thinking of places in the east like Toretsk, which we were told was likely to fall last year, but there's been something of a fighting defense there. It's still under a lot of pressure, of course, to be realistic about the situation. But what does that say about Putin and Russia's military capabilities and capacity to seize land in Ukraine at the moment?
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Because over the winter and then springtime, that was that period where, America suddenly said, right, we're not going to provide support. The intelligence isn't going to be flowing. And we said at the time that if I was President Putin and his Russian generals, I'd be pushing really hard now. And we did see some significant advances on the battlefield. But we have been seeing areas like Pokrovsk and, as you say, Sumy. There's lots of areas where Russia has not maintained that momentum. And let's be, again, really clear, in case listeners forget, that it's a lot more difficult on the offense than it is on the defense. Generally, as long as you've planned your defense, you're going to have trench lines. Your enemy has to get out of their trenches and march towards you. That makes them vulnerable, and therefore they do suffer greater casualties. It's also, Russia has got a lot of conscripts, a few remaining convicts as well. None of them are superbly well motivated. They do have these barricade forces behind them. So if any of the Russian forces turn and run, they get shot by their own people. Hell of a motivation for charging at the enemy. But it's no great surprise that you get these little pushes by the Russians and then a pause, because it's actually very, very difficult to maintain momentum. And this grinding war, I suspect what President Putin is judging is that for Ukraine, it's honestly less about equipment and more about manpower. There is a gradually declining number of people in Ukraine that can fight. But at the moment, Ukraine's bravery, tenacity, courage is holding the ground. And the one thing that the West has to remember, I see every now and again, we talk about the number of artillery shells and bullets we're ramping up. If you simply give Ukrainian forces the tools of a grinding war of attrition, where it's man on the battlefield, the bigger side will win. In the absence of having air power, Ukraine doesn't have air power. In the absence of having high-tech weapons, it becomes a brutal battle of attrition. And bluntly, that's something that Russia will win. It is the bigger force. So somehow, in order to help Ukraine's got to be provided with high-tech weapons that allow precision strike, not only at the front line, but also in the depth areas, so that Russia suffers greater and greater blows, and it makes it more and more difficult for it to advance.
Yeah, and we mentioned some of those other domains of warfare. Ukraine has been hit this week with some of the hardest air and drone strikes of the war by Russia. In terms of what else needs to be supplied to Kiev for their defense, presumably it's also things like those crucial Patriot batteries and similar air defense systems that can help them repel these attacks.
It is. I think what's fascinating about the attacks on Kyiv is, why is Russia choosing to do this now? I don't think there's any suggestion that Russia is going to mount an assault on Kyiv. That would be a step too far, frankly, for Putin's forces. So the question is, Russia doesn't have endless supply of missiles or drones either. And so the question then becomes, why is it wasting so many drones and missiles on Kyiv? Now, please don't get me wrong. I've visited Kyiv several times. It's a beautiful city. And undoubtedly, the locals will be suffering as a result of these barrages. But it's not going to win Russia the war. And Kyiv is a huge city. It's not going to level the city by using isolated missiles. It's well known that Russia's missile supplies are dwindling. And of course, they were getting a lot of these missiles from Iran. And of course, Iran's probably not selling too many missiles at the moment. It probably needs them for its own devices. So there really is really a question about what's the strategy here. And I don't know. Clearly, you'd have to get inside President Putin's mind to know what that is. But I get this sense at the moment that there's almost a sense of anger in Putin. Never a good thing for a military battle, because it wasn't that long ago that Ukraine managed to strike Russia's strategic bomber fleet. And we can get into that if you like, but that wasn't just a glancing blow. That hurt President Putin. It was not just about its ability to bomb Ukraine. As a former RAF pilot, I know that our quick reaction alert that's 24/7 in this country out of Lossiemouth and Coningsby launches to intercept Russian bears that they regularly come off the top of to test our defences. Now, there's been a noticeable drop-off in the number of those aircraft coming round. That is all part of Russia's posture, its world stage, its prowess, its strength. That will have hurt Putin, and therefore I suspect some of what we're seeing is a sense of anger and frustration. I'm not finished yet, I can still influence. That's bad news for Kyiv, but it isn't going to change the outcome of the war.
Yes, and Russia is still cleaning up at home after that attack. There's reports they're now having to relocate bombers, build bunkers and fortified hangars on air bases. How expensive is that for an air force to carry out?
It is quite expensive. I suspect, though, that it's a little bit about closing the gate after the horse has bolted, because you'll remember that when the West started providing long range missiles to Ukraine, Russia moved some of its strategic assets further away, out of range of those missiles. Now, why is that important? Because two things. One of which, if you move big aircraft away from their home base, generally they don't have those home base protections. They don't have the big hangars. They don't have the facilities. And Russia almost certainly thought by putting them 1,000 miles away, in some cases more than that, from the front line, that they were absolutely immune from attack from the Ukrainian forces. What was clever, though, is that it wasn't just about moving. When I was flying, you may have 100 fighter jets, but a third of those are probably under maintenance at any one time. Some of them will be unserviceable, long-term sick, and be cannibalized for spares. The available fleet you only have that can fly is normally about a third of the number. Now, Russia is not famous for having hugely reliable aeroplanes, particularly the Bear. I mean, that was introduced to service before I was born, and that was a long time ago. So these things are always struggling for serviceability. They cannibalize them. My point being, the number of aircraft of the fleet that they advertise that's actually available to fly is relatively small. The ones that were able to fly were able to flee to these airfields, and the ones that got to those airfields, they were the ones that targeted. So whilst the Ukrainian forces may not have struck many, I think they were up to 41 total. If you look at the proportion of the serviceable aircraft that they hit, it could be the majority of those fleets. And it was Bears, backfires, and the intelligence gathering mainstays. So that will have had a profound impact. And you can't just, once again, nip down to the shops and restock supplies. These things, the supply lines have long since closed. That will leave a hole, a long and big enduring hole in Russia's military capability.
And how do you judge the difference in the way that Russia operates and maintains its air force, its airfields, compared to us in Western Europe as well?
Well, the one thing that's very different is that the Russian Air Force is not an independent arm of the services. So they are a sort of an artillery arm of the army. Doctrinally, and I don't want to get into the whole, but we used to have an RAF that was part of the army. But in 1918, we formed an independent service, recognizing that if an army is in battle, it wants you to support them in that battle. Whereas there actually might be benefits in striking the bridge a few miles behind the enemy lines where the replacement tanks are coming. You might not see the benefit of that directly, but my goodness, that helps you win the war. Russia doesn't have that. And as a result, it really is just an arm of the Soviet. But I think the point is that whilst Ukraine was able to attack the Russian fleet, we have got complacent in the West as well. Literally, yesterday, we were reporting on an incursion onto Brize Norton, Royal Air Force Brize Norton in Oxfordshire, where a couple of our big tanker aircraft were damaged. They were sprayed. Now, while some of the MPs talked about that as being vandalism, vandalism is when you spray a monument and it has to be cleaned off. This was actually far, far worse. This was sabotage, because this was actually stopping military aircraft flying. We only have 14 of these tankers. 2 of them were taken out of use as a result of that. And they are not just tankers being used in the Middle East. These are being used on the eastern flank of NATO. They are helping defend our island shores, both in the north and south of the country, and also in the Falkland Islands. This was a significant damage. But the point is, we have not got the same level of protection that we used to have. And therefore, in the same way that Russia suffered those attacks from Ukraine, thank goodness the attacks at Brize Norton appear to be just a couple of wayward protesters. What would have happened if we'd had a serious attack by some state like Russia? That could have been far, far more damaging.
Lots for NATO to consider about the new situation they find themselves in with this conflict in Europe and more widely. Obviously, there'll be a lot of discussions about all of this coming up in the NATO summit in The Hague, especially after the G7 meeting was pretty flat. It didn't really seem to achieve too much, especially on Ukraine. Is there anything we should expect or look for coming out of this upcoming NATO summit?
I think we're already seeing some of the impact of this. It's quite. I always try and steer clear of politics, but what I would say is that it's pretty clear that President Trump is less of a team player. More, he wants to be. He doesn't like to be surrounded by lots of other nations and compromise. This is all about make America first. I think with the G7, he left early, trying to avoid any sort of being bullied or cajoled into compromises. And we're already seeing for the NATO summit, there seems to be a focus on trying to placate Trump. We understand that already they're not going to talk about some of the really pithy issues facing NATO. A lot of the member countries, how to deal with Ukraine, how to deal with Russia, resurgent Russia, and it does appear now that they're doing far less about that, far more focusing on how much money each of the nations are spending. President Trump famously has talked about 3.5% on defense spending, total of 5%, including other defense-related activities. But also, even if that money was to be forthcoming tomorrow, you don't have a defense industrial base to actually build it. But I think far more importantly, and it's starting to emerge now, is that NATO didn't really have robust plans for how to defeat if Russia was to continue. And I think part of that is really important that NATO works out what those plans are and then where the shortfalls are, because bluntly, that's where the work really has to start. It's one thing a politician waving a magic wand saying, yes, we'll all commit 3.5% to 5% spending, but how do you translate that into actionable military capability? That takes often decades. And at the moment, we probably don't have that time. So I suspect we're going to see Trump go. We're going to see a lot of fawning to President Trump, a lot of providing him with the ammunition to say, look, NATO is stepping up to the plate. But the difficult conversations about what to do about President Putin, who does seem to be going rogue, despite President Trump's efforts, it is evident Putin has no intention of stopping the war. Therefore, do you simply observe what Russia's doing and watching it grind away at Ukraine, or do you try and stop Russia? And that's a conversation really that needs to be happening and now.
Yeah, and as you say, a lot of this discussion is about these spending figures. Is there a worry there that more money for European defence might not also mean more support for Ukraine then?
I think you can't separate the two, but I think from a defence analyst perspective, I look at the sort of post-Cold War era as being a defence dividend, a peace dividend. We were spending over 4% of our GDP on defence. Since then, we've dropped it to arguably just around 2%. And at the moment, if you actually do the forensic analysis, we're replacing the nuclear deterrent, so we're spending twice as much, maintaining the current one and replacing it. We're also putting $3 billion a year from the defence budget into Ukraine, and we're also paying out the defence budget for Diego Garcia. All of those things means that actually the amount of money available for defence is not growing at the moment. It might be in terms of the public eye, but not ourselves. And I think part of the challenge, therefore, is that we've had 35 years of a lack of spending that has left grave capability gaps in our country. One example of that is when I was a young lad, we used to have all sorts of missile defense systems over our country. Not an Iron Dome, but a layered defense. If you look at that now, we no longer have that. And if you look at what Russia's been doing to Kyiv, long-range strikes, at least Kyiv can protect itself. If you look at what Iran's doing to Israel, Iron Dome system, even with that, some are getting through. The UK has nothing like that. We have early warning systems, a couple of minor systems to defend ourselves. We don't. That's an example of the sorts of gaps that exist at the moment. And therefore, going back to your question, do you prioritise getting our own home in order, getting our fortress built and make sure we're ready for this new era? Or do you focus your efforts on helping Ukraine not lose the war? And that's the real problem at the moment. Limited resources, a defence industrial base that isn't generating enough anyway, and there's a massive shortcoming. And that's a real issue, a real challenge for our military and our politicians to decide.
And of course, while all of this debate discussion is going on, a lot of attention, as you say, is on the Iran-Israel conflict, possible US support for regimes change or US strikes. When asked, Putin said he wouldn't even discuss this idea of what happens to the current Iranian regime. But Russia, is hardly rushing to Iran's aid in this conflict. How damaging could it be for the Kremlin if they lose a second ally in the Middle East in the space of almost 6 months?
Well, I think, yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, I think that the danger is if you follow the trail of where we get to that question, first of all, is that Netanyahu's talking about regime change. I don't think you're ever going to get regime change as a result of air bombardments. Iran still has one of the biggest standing armies around. If you add up its serving army, about 2/3 of a million, about its reserve is about 1/3 of a million. They've barely been touched by what's going on at the moment. This is all about stopping Iran's nuclear program and also its ability to strike Israel. Those two are all around nuclear facilities and missiles. And if you look at it bluntly, Israel has clearly been planning for some years, watching the diplomatic efforts to slow down Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon, and has finally decided, eventually they're going to get that weapon. And when they do, that's an existential threat to Israel. They've decided, therefore, they've got to act. They've dusted off this plan, which was 2 years in the making, probably, and therefore off they've gone. Now, there's interesting what assumptions they'd have to make there. They would keep it secret, because even telling Americans, because the first thing they wanted to strike was the scientists. Because as soon as you give warning to the Iranian scientists that there's something's coming, they'd all scatter to the winds. They'd be impossible to find. So it's got to be a surprise. Secondly, it's got to be systematic, roll back the Iranian air defense systems, and then go after the targets. You therefore have to assume that you are doing it on your own. And I suspect, therefore, the Israeli plan does not require American support. Would it be helpful to have the big bunker busters and all of the well-advertised bombs? Of course it would. But Netanyahu is also dropping into the conversation now about regime change. But again, bluntly, I think that's highly unlikely. And besides, if he was doing that, my assessment of the situation is that many in the Middle East, many of the countries like Saudi and otherwise, Iran is the black sheep of the Muslim world, the Arab world, and therefore they probably wouldn't want it to have nuclear weapons. But as soon as you start talking about regime change, there'll be a worry. The Arab Spring, there's not too much democracy around the Middle East, and therefore I suspect the support for what Israel doing would evaporate in a heartbeat, and a lot more pressure would be brought to bear. So one in an awful circle, yes, it's interesting to talk about regime change. I suspect Putin has no interest in talking about that. The irony of this situation, if I leave you with this, is that whilst Russia and Iran are aligned, and therefore Russia is naturally a bedfellow for Iran, there'll be crocodile tears that Putin is crying, because with this conflict, the oil price has soared, and over recent months, the declining oil price has put a huge amount of pressure on Russia's ability to fund the war. So this has been a very, very welcome step for Russia in terms of topping up its finances.
On the other side of that, of course, Tehran has been supplying Russia with arms, especially air weapons. Is this likely to harm Russia's stockpiles? Because we know that they have started producing some of those Iranian weapons domestically as well.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll have an impact. But I think one of the things we forget in this country is that Russia's put itself on a war footing. It's spending vast amounts of money in its economy, on its military capability, and it's generating huge amounts of weapons. There's nobody really around who remembers the Second World War, but we were converting car factories to building aircraft and the like, and the whole national enterprise around war, which effectively is what Russia's doing at the moment. We've not been doing that in the West. And as gradually Russia invests more and more money in that economy, it's more and more autonomous, less and less reliant on other countries. So yes, will it be seeing the shock of not having Iranian missiles? Quite possibly. Iran will almost certainly be using all that it can produce at the moment, and its facilities for manufacturing and storing them are all being targeted. But I suspect if you look at its drones, where there's been a massive increase, I was interested to see the other day that as a sort of student of history. I'm not a historian, but most of the casualties on most battlefields in the World War II, World War I were artillery shells. On this battle now, over 80% of the casualties are being caused by drones. So I think that's where the investment lies. That's where the technology is going. I suspect that Russia's using Chinese help rather than Iran or North Korea. They're not known for their high-tech drone capabilities. So I suspect Russia will be missing some of those missiles, but I don't think it'll miss a step in terms of its war in Ukraine.
Well, retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, host of the Red Matrix podcast, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
You're welcome, Louis.